In this video, we'll continue our discussion on sentences by talking about fragments and run-ons, two common errors in writing. We got our first look at fragments in the previous video. Remember that a sentence is comprised of a character and an action or a state of being. It also expresses a complete thought. When one or both of those criteria are not met, then you have a sentence fragment. These are easy to spot in short sentences or when the character or action is obviously missing. But in some cases, especially longer or more complex sentences, they can be easy to miss. A quick word of advice. Always be careful when editing your papers. As you revise, you can accidentally remove the character or action and end up with a fragment. Let's look at three types of fragments. These first kind are relatively obvious. They are either missing the character or the action. In the first example, Jack, Tom, Sally, and I all, there's no action. What are we all doing? In the second example, watched the movie and ate popcorn, there are no characters. But if we combine our action and our characters, we get a complete sentence. These kinds of fragments are easier to spot than others and were covered in the previous video, so we can move on. A clause is something that has a character and an action, but it doesn't necessarily express a complete thought. Look at this clause. While Jack, Tom, Sally, and I watched the movie and ate popcorn. We have a character and an action, but the clause begins with what's called a subordinating conjunction, which is just a fancy way of saying that it starts with a word that prevents this clause from being a sentence. After reviewing the two examples here, try to write your own clause that begins with a subordinating conjunction. I've listed a few here, but there are lots more. Don't try to memorize a list. Instead, try to recognize how subordinating conjunctions affect a sentence. Then you'll be able to recognize them no matter how irregular they are. In a later video, we'll experiment with combining subordinating clauses with complete sentences. It gets really hard to recognize a sentence fragment when we have longer, complex sentences that have lots of different phrases in them. When we write and revise, we need to make sure that no matter how complex or long our sentence is, it's obvious to us and to our readers whom the characters are and what the action is. Here, there is a character, the British, but if you look closely, there's no action. Try to revise this sentence so our character, the British, are doing something. Don't look until you've tried it, but I've included an example revision in the About section below this video. Now let's talk about run-on sentences. Run-ons are when we have two or more sentences that aren't connected or separated in the proper way. Keep in mind, a single sentence can have multiple characters and multiple actions, as shown here. Bob and Sally slow danced and hummed old country songs to each other. We have two characters, Bob and Sally, and they're doing two things, slow dancing and singing. But if we have two pairs of sentences, that is, two separate complete thoughts, each with its own character and action, then we have to separate them properly. Look at this example of a run-on. Bob slow danced and Sally sang old country songs. Imagine separating these. Bob slow danced, period. Sally sang old country songs, period. Each of those examples is a complete thought, has a character and an action, and is a complete sentence. So if we're going to put them together, we have to connect them in a certain way. This is when it's important to remember what makes up a sentence: a complete thought, a character, and an action or a state of being. Keeping that in mind will let us know when and how to connect sentences. Here's the first and most common way to connect two sentences besides using a period: a comma and a conjunction. If you have two sentences you want to put together, you can put a comma at the end of the first, followed by the words either for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. Then you can write your second sentence without having to place a period. The result is a compound sentence. Let's look at some examples. Achebe is an incredible writer, and I love to read his books. This correct connection of two sentences helps demonstrate their relationship. Let's look at the second example. Soyinka might not be as well known as Achebe, but his play, Death and the King's Horseman, is required reading. Here, the comma and conjunction, or comma fanboy if you prefer, demonstrates the relationship again. Something that is required reading is usually well known, so the word but is appropriate, since fewer people have read Soyinka's plays than have read Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart. Semicolons can do the same thing, join two independent sentences, but they are less common. You would only use a semicolon when two ideas are very closely related. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of semicolons, but they are used frequently enough to merit discussing. Let's look at some examples. In each of these examples, you could use a comma followed by and, but that creates a different feel. Both versions would be equally correct, but semicolons show a closer relationship and sound different when read. While the comma conjunction way of connecting two sentences is useful, not all connections are expressed by those 7 conjunctions. If you want to show a different kind of relationship between two clauses or two sentences, you can use a semicolon, followed by a conjunctive adverb, followed by a comma. Before you run for the hills, relax, this isn't as hard as it sounds. And you already know the hard part, recognizing when you have two sentences you want to join together. Let's look at examples. Here we have two sentences. The first is, I didn't like the movie. The second is, I did have a great time hanging out with my friends. To show the relationship between these and connect them into one sentence, we can place a semicolon after the first sentence, followed by the word however, followed by a comma. Once you start practicing constructions like these, you'll see them used everywhere in writing. Review the final two examples, then try writing your own. If you master these concepts, you should be able to avoid both fragments and run-ons, and you'll be able to write more interesting sounding sentences. I know it's a lot, so you may need to watch this video a few more times. Pay attention when you read and practice on your own. But as you do, combining sentences correctly and avoiding fragments will become more and more natural.